This is episode 111 of the Death to Tyrants podcast. Hey guys, let me tell you about the sponsor for today's show, and that is Lorenzotti Coffee. Oh my goodness, it is so damn good. I kid you not, I found myself the last few mornings waking up earlier than normal just because I'm so excited to drink this coffee that the guys sent me. It is so good. Let me tell you about them really quick. They basically import coffee from a roaster in Naples. Well, now they've got it on their website. You can order it. It is so damn good. They've got ground, whole bean, anything you like over there. And trust me, you won't be disappointed. I do it in the French press. That's how I make my coffee every morning. And I'm so stoked to have these guys as a sponsor. They love liberty. They love the Death to Tyrants podcast. And so we should support them, right? We want the good people to get our money. And when you go over to lorenzotti.coffee, that's LORENZOTTI.coffee, and you use our promo code at checkout, DTTP, for the Death to Tyrants podcast, you get 10% off your order. And they are not expensive, guys, but boy, it tastes expensive. You will not be disappointed. Our sponsor, Lorenzotti Coffee, LORENZOTTI.coffee. Go check them out and use promo code DTTP at checkout. Let's get to the show.
The crushing weight of the tyrant's passage had left nothing unmarked.
You get split in fucking half, but I call him the hologram graph. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquid, and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
What's up, you guys? Welcome back once again to the Death to Tyrants podcast. As always, I am your host and humble narrator, Buck Johnson, coming to you out of Austin, Texas. Man, this guy today is pretty damn good. I got to brag right up front about him. I am joined by Spike Cohen, the vice presidential nominee for the Libertarian Party in the presidential race coming up in November 2020. Spike, he's running under Jo Jorgensen. She's the presidential nominee, of course. I had her on here a few weeks ago, and she was so busy at the time that I got just a 20 to 30 minute short little interview. Today, I've got Spike on here for just about an hour, and we go over all kinds of issues, and he gives such a wonderful perspective and way to educate a lot of people on so many topics here. I think you'll be quite impressed. I was looking back on my adult life as a libertarian since about 2000, and I can remember the presidential candidate we had every year since then. And honestly, I cannot remember one impressive vice presidential candidate since then. And maybe I've overlooked one, write me and let me know, but I cannot remember one. And my goodness, Spike Cohen is quite impressive. I think you'll agree. He started a web design company in 1999, which he just retired from 3 years ago, to now promote libertarian ideas full time. His great aim is to make people more familiar with voluntary solutions and property rights. He's the host of My Fellow Americans, the co-host of the Muddied Waters of Freedom, and the co-owner of Muddied Waters Media, a podcast platform that reaches millions. Well, I'm fortunate to have him join us here on Death to Tyrants. He's here today, the vice presidential nominee for the Libertarian Party ticket in 2020. Jeremy Spike Cohen, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm doing great, Buck. How are you doing?
I'm wonderful. I'm pretty dang excited about this because I've heard you a few times on podcasts and internet appearances, we'll call it, and it was really refreshing. I was blown away, to be quite honest with you. So,
well, thank you. That means a lot.
Yeah, I've been around the LP for a couple of decades, and I really, other than 2016, which is, I'm not remembering for a good reason, I can't remember a vice presidential candidate. And I've been voting for the LP candidates since 2000. And all of a sudden it's like, my God, we have a vice presidential candidate that is blowing me away and not disappointing me. So that's awesome.
Blowing you away in a positive way, like you said. We don't talk about 2016 anymore.
Right. Yeah, it was. Yeah, you've been impressive. So I've been looking forward to this. We'll jump right in here. I
Sure.
guess the first question I asked Dr. Jorgensen, it was, what does libertarianism mean to you? Because some people think it's a lifestyle. Some people say it's basically just one simple phrase, and that sums up all of it, which can be extrapolated, far and wide as you want to take it. What is it to you?
I believe libertarianism is a way of looking at how we interact with ourselves and with others. And so if when people say, what is your, elevator pitch for libertarianism? It's pretty simple to me. You own yourself, you own your life, you own your body, you own your labor, and you own the product of your labor, which is your property. Those things are exclusive to you. You intuitively and innately are the only person who should be able to enjoy the exclusive ownership and enjoyment of that. Now, you can share it, you can give it away, you can sell it, you can lend it, you can do whatever you want, you can release it out, you can do whatever you want with it because it is yours. We naturally want to interact with each other, both in cooperation and competition. So it is not saying that we are only an island to ourselves. It is saying that what we are, what is intrinsic to us, belongs to us, and that anyone trying to take from each other is an inherent violation of that and what we call an act of aggression. And we believe aggression is wrong, not just from a moral standpoint, that it makes sense. You shouldn't be able to harm people or take their stuff. It also doesn't work. If I can take from you and all of the people listening to this whenever I see fit, I'm not going to be a very good steward of what I have compared to if the only things I could get were as a result of voluntary interactions with other people. If I can take from you whenever I see fit, I can just take more. So why do I have to be a good steward? Why do I have to make good decisions with what I have? I don't. I can just take more. And you, dear listeners, don't have to worry about, aren't going to be as good of a steward of what you have either, because I can take it from you at any time. So now you're making more short-term, short-sighted decisions because you might not have it. I might take it from you. And everything we are seeing right now, every bad centrally planned policy from the Republicans and the Democrats, every act of statism against our inherent self-ownership, every infringement upon our natural rights, every act of oppression from tyrants against us is nothing more than the act of people assuming and presuming the authority to take from us and aggress upon us as they see fit. And libertarianism runs entirely counter to that. We seek a world set free in our time. And set free is not some, catch-all term for telling people they can do what they want. Set free means that they are free to enjoy their self-ownership and their autonomy and to work in cooperation and competition with others in free association as they see fit. It is a world completely set free. That is libertarianism to me.
In which areas of political and, we'll say, government policy do you think libertarianism is most needed? I mean, the easy answer would be all of it, which I would agree with. But what pops in your mind initially?
I think the most acute things right now, and yes, as a full spectrum libertarian, it's hard for me not to just say, well, all of it, because it really all does tie together. But I think the most acute things that we are seeing right now is the massive amounts of harm that are being done by the state and its affiliates towards people. So, for example, the wars, police brutality, the systemic oppression of entire demographics of people, the putting people in cages for victimless offenses, for victimless commerce, and then staining them with a felony record for the rest of their life so that they can never really get ahead, other than to return to the whatever illegal commerce they were engaging in, or just ending up back in prison or just living in abject poverty. All of these things are just major acts of harm. So we can break down why, for example, the welfare state is in the long term a bad thing. But my priority is not ending the welfare state. My priority is ending the harm and the barriers that have been put in place by the state that have forced people into a situation where they need welfare to begin with. Quick story here. I have done door knocking tours in housing projects. And not a single one of them said, oh, no, thanks, liberty, that sounds great. Criminal justice reform, that sounds great. But I really just like living on welfare. I don't have to work, and I get to live this terrible, threadbare existence in substandard housing with the police looking down, really all of society looking down on me, and the police coming through and harassing me all the time. I love it. No one did that. In fact, everyone had illegal side hustles. They're not allowed to do these things because they can't afford the thousands or tens of thousands of dollars in compliance costs to be able to do these things legally, but they're still doing it because they want to get ahead. We naturally want to thrive, and we naturally want to solve the problems that we face, both big and small, not just our immediate problems like needing food and housing and healthcare and things like that, but the larger societal problems, things that allow us to create a better quality of life for ourselves and our loved ones and our communities. The most important thing to me is ending the harm and the barriers and the actual destruction that is taking place at the hand of the state, so that people can thrive and people can get ahead in life.
How would that translate then through, I guess, we'll say programs that need to immediately be cut?
So the first priorities of a Jorgensen administration are ending the wars, bringing the troops home, ending the infringements on our lives, rights, and property. So ending the war on drugs, ending the gun laws, ending the war on migration and the war on trade, and allowing people to associate and travel as they see fit, ending that massive police state and surveillance state infringement on our lives, ending the mass warrantless wiretapping and surveillance programs, ending the auditing and ending the Federal Reserve. Here's something that I'm sure you talk about this on your podcast as well, but it often gets overlooked. When we think about all the harm that's being done, none of that could happen if they had to get our direct consent for it.
Right.
We wouldn't agree to be taxed to pay for this empire. We wouldn't agree to be taxed to have people herded into cages so that for-profit prison labor contractors can make tens of billions of dollars a year. We wouldn't agree to this. So instead, they just have the Federal Reserve print out endless reams of trillions of banknotes and immediately lend them to the federal government at rock bottom rates that we have to pay off the interest on in the form of treasury bonds, 40-year treasury bonds that we and our children and their children and their children have to pay off so that they can finance whatever they want without even having to get our approval. Not only does it do that, but it also, by adding all of that additional currency to the money supply without increasing the value, it also reduces the value of our Federal Reserve notes that are in our pockets and in our wallets and in our bank accounts and that we use to pay for our way through life, because we're forced to use it. And so we would end the Federal Reserve and end the federal government's monopoly on the issuance and distribution of currency. We would allow the free market to provide different competing systems of currency that would compete to provide us the most valuable currencies that would gain value over time because they inherently want us to use it. There would be no incentive for them to just print out a bunch of the currency because we'd all stop using it because it would become worthless.
Right.
So we would end that. We would end police brutality by ending civil asset forfeiture, ending the 1033 military surplus program, ending no-knock raids, ending minimum sentencing, just down the line criminal justice reforms. And those are the things that would be our top priorities moving forward.
And I assume in there, you might have even touched upon it, ending sanctions and tariffs, I assume is in there as well.
I consider that part of the war.
Yep.
Okay. I think when you are the first way that you get a population okay with bombing or invading or destabilizing another country is by severing all trade. So there's not much appetite for us to go to war with France, even though a lot of us might not, a lot of people might not like France or might not like French foreign policy, or what I know a lot of conservatives don't. I know when I was a neocon, I hated France. Now I actually like France, but whatever feelings people might have about it, there's no appetite to go to war with them, even at times that, our governments disagree, because we have massive amounts of trade. Same thing with Canada, same thing with Mexico, same thing with all of the countries that we have with trade. I regret that it was actually Bernie Sanders who said this because it's a great quote. He said, if we're not trading goods and services, we're trading bombs and bullets. And as we know, we don't usually trade. It's really a one-ended, a one-sided thing. We pick on countries. Our government picks on countries that can't really fight back. But the bottom line is that the reason they introduced these sanctions isn't just to punish those governments and to punish those people and to make them suffer needlessly because of the actions of their government that didn't line up with our government's actions. And not only does it punish us needlessly by closing down markets to our trade, but it also creates a situation where there's no interest in this country who's saying, wait a second, I'm making money there because the money's already been cut off. And in fact, if you're a big business, a big crony business, and you got all this money that you were making in Iran, and you know the only way that's ever going to open back up is if that government is toppled by the U.S. military, now you're saying, hey, listen, go ahead and do what you need to do so I can do business there again. So it creates an perverse incentive for government to invade countries. So no, when I talk about ending the wars, and when Joe talks about it, we mean sanctions and tariffs as well.
Excellent, well put. Here's a contentious one that's always argued within libertarian circles. These
are my favorites.
Yeah, I know, and it's cool to hear unique perspectives on it. And
yes,
it's the open borders thing, and because everyone goes, well, how are you going to deal with it with the current reality versus the libertarian theory? The common question I hear, and I want to ask you this, is do you believe it's important to end the welfare state and end drug laws before you would open the borders? Is there an order to do this kind of thing? How would that work? And I guess given the current restraints we have, given also a Jorgensen-Cohen presidency, how would that work?
So the short answer there is that if people are concerned about the welfare state, then the easy way to deal with that is just say that if they come here, they can't get on welfare. And the response is often, well, that's impossible. You'll never get government to do that. Well, if that's the case, how are you going to get government to stop everyone from coming here?
Right.
Because one is a lot easier than the other. The longer answer to that is that we know from all sorts of data that immigrants, both legal and illegal, are actually less likely than native-born Americans of the same income level to end up on the welfare state. They're not coming here to get on welfare. Now, if they come here and something is offered and is available, they'd be fools not to take it. But they're not coming here for welfare. Most of them are actually coming here to escape the destabilized countries that U.S. industrial or intelligence services have destabilized for various political concerns or political goals, and destabilized through the war on drugs, as you mentioned. So yes, I believe we should end the war on drugs, and I believe that we should be getting rid of the barriers that lead people to need the welfare state in general. Because what I have seen and what the data shows is that the vast majority of people, both people that are born here and people that come here, if they end up on welfare, it's because they need it or it was provided to them, and because they qualify. It's not, you don't have people who are saying, oh man, there's this really good paying career that I could get, but man, I really would just rather live in substandard housing for free. Are there some people like that? Yes, they are way, way, way outnumbered by people who are forced into generational poverty by the barriers that government and its cronies have created precisely to keep them in their place and make them where they cannot disrupt and become entrepreneurs and disrupt the big boys at the top, but instead have to either live on welfare or essentially become wage slaves to those same cronies. Mm-hmm. So if you can remove those barriers, which effectively makes the welfare state a non-starter. But again, if there is a concern, I would absolutely, and I'm sure Joe would say the same, I know Joe would say the same, be perfectly fine with saying we open the borders and we simply make it where they cannot get on welfare. And that would solve that aversion to it, even though, again, the data shows that they're not coming here to get on welfare. But if that is a point of contention, great, they can't get on welfare.
Right, well put. Do you think you should reach out to people on the left and people on the right in different ways? Do you kind of tailor your message, or is it the same message, and if they like it, they like it?
It is the same message from their precepts. So the short answer is yes. I think if I'm talking to and I can't always know who I'm talking to, but if I know I'm talking with one of the things people like about me is, yes, I was endorsed by the Mises Caucus. I am very much a right libertarian, an ANCAP. And yet I have brought in countless numbers of Bernie bros and former Bernie bros and former Yang gangers and former Tulsi twins, I don't know, Tulsi supporters, into the Libertarian Party and help make them into, doctrinaire libertarians because I came to them from their precepts. I started and owned and operated and grew a very successful web design company for the better part of 20 years. I started it in my teens back in 1999, and I sold it 3 years ago so I could focus full time on libertarian messaging. And what I have learned both in the operating of that business and in my messaging for libertarianism is that the formula for reaching people is actually way more simple than we want to make it sound. The way you reach people is you go to where they are in their spaces, and from their precepts. And when you do that, and then what you do is you listen to them. You listen to what their concerns are. And then what you do is you demonstrate that you listened. You said, "Oh wow, that's terrible that you are dealing with that problem with, for example, healthcare." I'll use healthcare as an example. So when I talk to people on the left about healthcare, here's what I hear overwhelmingly. And it also disabuses me of the idea that they are of the left. They've just gone there because of the situation that they're in often. They're not doctrinaire progressives. And that's true of most people on the right as well. That's just who reached out to them and who made the most sense to them. So someone on the left talking about healthcare, they'll say, for example, I think that what Bernie Sanders is correct. What Bernie Sanders says is correct because I don't know. I went to an emergency room a couple of years ago and I'm still paying for it and it ruined me financially. And I have a cousin or friend or whatever, loved one of some kind, who has a chronic health issue and they are losing everything because they can't afford the treatment. I think healthcare is a right. We need healthcare. And, I see these other countries, these other developed countries that have free healthcare. And that just makes sense. And, Bernie gets it. Bernie gets that, this for-profit system we have with these greedy people making billions of dollars while I don't even know how I'm going to be able to afford my next bill on healthcare is just wrong and immoral and it needs to change. Do you know what I heard there? I'm scared. I have no way of knowing how this is a major problem. I have no idea how to fix it. I recognize that there are some powerful people who are benefiting greatly from my suffering. And there is one person so far, one school of thought, Bernie and people who agree with Bernie, who are giving me an idea that sounds like it intuitively makes sense. These are not people saying, I want to destroy the healthcare market and introduce, Marxism. That's not what they're worried about. They're worried about their healthcare or anything else. Their education costs, their people that are closed borders conservatives are worried about losing their jobs. They're worried about their wages going down because of too much competition from immigrants. They're worried about the welfare state going up. All of these people are worried about something and they aren't getting a counter message to the prevailing authoritarian message that has been presented as the solution to that problem. And so, for example, when I talk to someone about healthcare, I say, this healthcare system is terrible. That's terrible what you're going through. And, we pay 3 times as much as, the developed nation average for healthcare. And if you even just look at the amount that is spent by the government is spending as much money is spending more money of taxpayer dollars per patient than almost every other country on earth, except for like 3 or 4 countries like Japan and Sweden and a couple of countries. Every other country on earth, even before you factor in how much we're spending out of pocket, they're already spending out of taxpayer money that's taken from us. This is a government-run healthcare system, and it is run terribly, and we need to fix it. And I'll talk about how the patent protection laws that are in place allow pharmaceutical companies to jack up the price on decades or even centuries old drugs, like insulin and freaking epinephrine, and jack it up 20-fold because of patent protections that have been put in place precisely for them to be able to do that, while we ourselves are not even allowed to travel to another country and buy something that is legal there and here and then bring it back in our bag. I talk about the certificate of need laws where people who want to build hospitals and MRI machines and clinics have to beg and scrape to local governments for permission to be able to have it built. And that the reason for that is to protect the existing providers in that area who don't want competition. I talk about the fact that the CDC stopped healthcare professionals, the medical professionals, from testing and treating COVID patients for the first 6 to 8 weeks that it was here, which allowed it to become the outbreak and the pandemic that it is now. That American healthcare policies at best lead to ridiculous cost overruns and absurd restrictions in supply and care and access. And in conditions like a pandemic, leads to countless hundreds of thousands of people dead for no good reason. And then, once I have demonstrated that I listened to what that had to say, that I gave a crap about them, and that I actually could be trusted, now I have presented actual solutions. And I can present solutions like ending those ridiculous laws, allowing and I'll talk about the history of how every time government has gotten involved in the healthcare market, it just drove up the cost and drove down the ability to seek access, and how we would unroll all of that and we would allow for the market to provide. But you have to start by agreeing with their precepts. Same thing with people, the way I answered your question on immigration. I didn't say, hey, you racist. Why would you think that immigrants are more likely to be on welfare? Is it because you think brown people are lazy? Well, I think walls are racist, and I think you're racist if you agree with it. What a terrible way to talk about something that someone cares about. We meet people from their precepts in their spaces. We agree with their concerns. Our mutual friend Scott Horton likes to say, libertarians are better than the left on issues that the left cares about. Yes. We are better than the right on issues the right cares about. So why start arguments with them? Why would we not just agree with their concerns and then present our solutions, which inherently make sense?
Yes, well put. Yeah, and I've always noticed, being in this philosophy and in this, libertarian bubble, maybe.
Right. It is absolutely a bubble.
Yeah.
Yes.
A lot of the insults that are thrown our way always paint this weird, cartoonish, incorrect version of libertarianism. And so it's easy to, it's just like, well, they think everyone's on an island. And so obviously that would never work. So what a bunch of morons or something. And I was reading something online earlier and I thought, I hadn't planned to ask this, but might as well throw it at Spike and see what his thoughts, because it's so interesting to me. You just kind of hit upon the regulations and stuff that messed up the response to COVID initially.
Right.
I don't know if I've ever seen anything so completely disprove the false idea of libertarianism than a viral pandemic. Turns out we're not all just a bunch of individuals on our own little me island where what we want to do affects no one and no one can affect us. And you would think, being in this a long time, like, why do people still have these weird cartoon versions of libertarianism? What would you say to that particular thing I just read?
Well, first, let me answer your second follow-up question as to why do people still think this? And the answer is because we haven't done the best job. And I will add myself to this. We are a relatively small group of people who love to argue.
Yes.
And it's with some of us, it's a hardwired thing. And with others of us, it's just what we've gotten used to in the prevailing culture here. We like creating arguments and we like presenting the best arguments with the idea that when we present the best arguments, people will have to look at it and logically conclude that we are clearly correct. And it doesn't matter if we acknowledge their feelings, because facts don't care about your feelings, right? And that is how we present things. That's not going to connect with people. Every single person on this planet, including you and me and everyone listening, processes everything with a combination of we process information with a combination of intuition, emotion, and intellect. And so libertarians are pretty high on the emotion and intellect. We don't like to admit that we're high on the emotion, but we're very high on the emotion and intellect. Not so much on the intuition. And again, I'm speaking generally. I'm not saying we're all like this. And even how we process stuff is different from day to day, from subject to subject, from mood to mood and everything else. But we tend to, all other things being equal, we tend to process things with a high level of intellect and emotion and not much intuition. And so as a result, we end up getting into conversations where we are not taking the social cues that this person doesn't like how we're treating them. Or we actively enjoy the fact that they don't like how we're treating them because they're bootlickers and they need to hear this. And the problem is, every time we do this, what we are doing is creating enemies. And so then when they hear that, libertarians are just selfish and don't care about anyone else, that makes sense to them because their interactions with libertarians have resulted in them being called a bootlicker because they wanted to know why we shouldn't have free healthcare like Sweden has, or that they wonder, they think maybe we do need to have some of these wars because maybe we need to protect ourselves from the terrorists who hate us for our freedoms, whatever. And instead of converting someone to libertarianism, we've converted them to anti-libertarianism. They are now weaponized against anything that could even be construed as libertarianism. They will now blame things that have nothing to do with us on libertarianism. Also, obviously, The bigwigs want to shut us out, man. Like, I mean, you see it every day. The media, the corporate media, which is owned by like 6 companies, and that includes Fox. So even the controlled opposition media is like 6 companies total. Those 6 companies are multinational, multi-billion, some multi-trillion-dollar companies who are so heavily ensconced in a system of patronage that they and their preferred pandering Republican and Democrat politicians have put in place, where they don't have to provide value to the market. They just have to convince the government to keep them at the top. And then they don't have to worry about continuing to provide value. They don't have to worry about making disruptions in the markets that better our lives so that they can retain their level of market share or anything like that. They just hold the rest of us down and force us to consume their products and work for them. Or do nothing. And that is the system they want. And they see us coming a mile away. They know that if we show up, that whole gravy train's over eventually. They either have to get rid of us, make sure we never get into office, or they have to try to convert us once we're there into the same, cronies that they have in place. And I think they recognize most of us aren't going to go along with it because we're not very intuitive. So we typically aren't going to take the social cues of, hey, if you go along with the ride, then you can be wealthy and powerful too. We don't hear that. We just want to have an argument with them. So they recognize that we're not going to be good people to do that with, and so they want to shut us out. So it's a combination of things that we're doing and things that are being done to us. But that is why I'm trying to work to change the culture within the Libertarian Party and the Libertarian movement. One, making us changing it into the face of something that is more kind and generous and empathetic and engaging, meets people where they are to bring them in from their precepts, agreeing with them on what their concerns are, validating their concerns, recognizing that, yes, facts are different than feelings, but our feelings determine how we process facts. And so we have to acknowledge and validate people's concerns and feelings and fears and everything else the same way that we would want others to do for us. And that once we do that, this is basic sales and marketing stuff. We can bring them in. We can bring them in and make them where they're doing the same thing, and we can change the cultural conversation, which is sorely needed in this country.
Something that's been coming up, that I think libertarians haven't dealt with yet, but I think we're going to have to, is the kind of giant corporations siding with woke culture and cancel culture over profit even. For instance, Disney wanting to pull ads and funding from the Tucker Carlson show. And there's some things that are going to be tough, in my opinion, for us to, how do we explain how to deal with this kind of thing? Because in the past, it's, well, a private business could do whatever they want, or naturally they're going to pursue profit over X, Y, and Z. But now there are certain corporations that are pushing an agenda that we may not agree with, yet it is kind of their own choice. So how do we deal with this moving forward with the giant corporations pushing wokeness and kind of siding with a certain side of the cultural war we may not be comfortable with?
So this is, and they are still pursuing profits. They're looking at the trend lines. Look at what happened with Nike. Nike went, and whether you agree, and I'll back up a little bit. I think I am glad that Colin Kaepernick did what he did, and it helped to awake people to police brutality and things like that. Now, I don't agree with everything Colin Kaepernick is doing, or what I really don't agree with what his proposed society would look like. But I do agree. I am glad that he did what he did, and I'm glad that he started that conversation or helped push along that conversation. Nike didn't give a crap about police brutality or systemic racism or black rights or anything else. Nike saw an amazing opportunity to grab an athlete and make an ad campaign and get a bunch of angry boomers who wear New Balance to say that they're burning their Nike stuff that they don't own. And so they would go to stores. You want to talk about performative virtue signaling. You had Trump supporting boomers going to stores, buying Nike stuff to burn it. Nike's like, that's fine. You already bought it.
You bought it. Yeah.
And so Nike's profits went through the roof. And they looked at their trend lines and their demographics, and they're like, yep, this is how we're going to make money. What you were seeing as major corporations who are, some people call it bowing to woke culture, they're seeing the trend lines. Woke culture is what is dominating the prevailing culture right now.
Mm-hmm.
And some of us think that it's the corporations pushing it down. I don't see that. I see that there is and wherever you want to say it came from, there is a growing level of kind of critical theory being applied to everything. And I think there's good and bad from that. I want to say I'm not 100% against woke culture. I'm not even 100% against cancel culture. I think what is happening is that any movement that suddenly finds itself having tremendous amounts of power will be abused. Bottom line, whether good, bad, whatever else, when suddenly something that almost non-existent not that long ago and was only occupied by the absolute fringes suddenly has tremendous amount of cultural and social cachet and is able to cause, call shots and make things happen, it's going to get abused. So I am not actually against the concepts behind cancel culture. That if you find someone who is engaging in, terrible, we talk about this. People will say, well, without government enforcing anti-discrimination laws, who's going to stop people from being bigots and discriminating? And we say, well, listen, if people want to be bigots and discriminate, they can. And we as a culture can, decide not to do business with them. And we can, open our own things and compete with them and basically drive them out of business. For lack of a better word, that's cancel culture. What's happened with cancel culture is that it's reached a point now where if someone tweeted something bad back in 2012, even if they apologize for it, they have to be destroyed. That is because wokeness and cancel culture in some circles has become somewhat malignant. It has people who feel powerless, who typically feel powerless and marginalized, who now recognize that they have power. And we see this with revolutions. The people who were the oppressed, they get that power, and now they're the oppressors. And it's kind of just human nature. Woke culture is just another example of market interactions of human nature. That, if power becomes too centralized and too sudden, where people aren't used to wielding it, they are often going to wield it in harmful and inequitable ways. And I do think that the woke culture and the counterculture and the cancel culture will eventually find an equilibrium. But I will say I am not against the idea of private actors punishing bad actors. I think what happens is it can, and Tucker Carlson, I'm glad he's anti-war, but he also calls for a lot of infringements on our basic rights and freedoms every single day. Mm-hmm. And I know that's not necessarily why they're going after Tucker Carlson, but I'm also not lost at the idea that he's lost some sponsors. I think he'll be fine. But I will say, so I think that cancel culture, people that are working to end systemic racism, people that are looking to tear down the statues of tyrants, there's some good and bad there. And I think that the bad is when they go a little malignant and go after people who maybe tweeted something bad 5 years ago, or they go after someone who isn't completely doctrinaire in their, intersectional studies or whatever. So I think there's definitely a malignant part to it. And I think it just speaks to, we talk about the marketplace of ideas. We need to inject our ideas into the marketplace. We need to inject free market ideas. I've been actively engaging Black Lives Matters protesters and civil rights protesters and civil rights attorneys and criminal defense attorneys. And my message, which is a doctrinaire, down the line, radical, principled libertarian message presented from their precepts, is getting a tremendous amount of traction. And it's getting traction because they're being engaged where they're used to just being pandered to by Democrats who show up and wear a kente cloth and, put their fist in the air and then go back and continue signing tough on crime legislation. So it is, I will say, I don't believe it's 100% bad what's happening there. And I think, the good that's happening there, we should be actively working to inject our ideas into that greater body politic and change the cultural conversation. And I think it will naturally find its equilibrium, and that equilibrium, if we are involved in that equilibrium finding, will lead itself towards talks about, it's already started, talks about decentralization, yes, less authority in the hands of a selected few and more authority being, evenly or decentrally distributed so that people have more individual say in their lives, and in smaller communities have more say in their lives. This is what we've been calling secession and privatization for decades now. They're calling it, communal, they're calling it community policing and voluntary policing and power to the people and social justice. But ultimately, if you tear away the labels, 80% of what we're talking about is the same thing. So I'm not 100% against it. I think we just need to inject our ideas into that.
You're so good that you're segueing to multiple questions I have without even realizing,
without even knowing it.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to go. I don't want to say where I was going to go, but you just touched upon one of them. Is what are your thoughts on secession in any form, really, a city, state, section? Do you think that it's coming at some point here? And what are your thoughts on it?
So I'm not going to speak on behalf of the campaign. I don't believe that the Jorgensen campaign has an actual policy on the question of secession or should states be able to break up or whatever else. And I would because that's a very, very understandably contentious subject, I would allow Joe to give the position of the campaign, which is what she's done on everything else. And I don't know what her position is on that. With that said, I can give my personal position from a 30,000 foot view. If you are to truly have the consent of the governed, then there must be an opt-out. Otherwise, you don't have the consent of the governed. This is, again, my personal opinion.
Sure.
And I'm not even speaking about specific instances. I am saying that in general, if we are saying that there is consent, then there must be the ability to opt out, or there is not truly consent. And so the problem, and this is now more of a historical conversation, the problem with talking about secession is that the last time there was secession,
right,
it was largely because, and if you read I live in South Carolina, which was one of the ground zero for the secession and Civil War, movement during the antebellum period, and if you read the Confederated States declarations of causes for seceding, they flat out said it was because they wanted to preserve the ability to, I mean, there were some other minor things, but the overwhelming reason was to preserve what they believed was their right to own black people because they didn't believe them to be the same level of person as a white man, as a white person, and that therefore white people had an inherent ability to own them as basically cattle or some weird status between human and cattle, which is what the prison system does now with black people, but that's a whole other subject.
Yes, it is.
It never ended. Chattel slavery never ended.
Right.
It just got taken from the private sector and made a government thing. But on this subject, so I am very careful when I talk about the subject, even before I was in this campaign, because it can very quickly sound like I'm promoting, that I wish the South had won or something like that. Here's what I will say. Some incredibly left-leaning people right now are very supportive of Chaz or CHOP or whatever it's being called right now, which is at its core, whether you agree with what they're doing or you think it's effective or not, it's a movement of secession. They literally said this plot of land no longer belongs to the United States, so say us.
That's right.
And it is not, I don't think it's going to result in a civil war necessarily. I'm not sure how long it will last necessarily, but it is at its core a secession. And that's honestly, and this is the less than fun part of running for office, is that I have to be a little bit more politic in how I present things, because in respect to this campaign and the fact that I'm not at this very moment aware of what Joe's position on secession is, I want to make sure I'm not saying that's contradicting her. But from a 30,000 foot view, my personal opinion is that in order to truly have consent, in any situation, there should be some ability to opt out in some way.
Yeah, I've actually thought many times that we might see it from a left-wing standpoint before we see it.
And here we are.
Yes, yeah. And it's funny, I mentioned recently to someone with Chaz and then the anti-police movement, we're hearing defund the police and you can't control us, we're our own territory. And I was like, I've been talking about these things for a long time. It's kind of cool now to hear it on such a mainstream platform.
I love meeting online with Black Lives and offline, because I've done some stuff offline as well, meeting with local and regional people that are organizing Black Lives Matters protests. And I'll say to them, hey, listen, I'm running for vice president. I want to hear what you want. And they start laying out what they want. And 80% of it, and I'll tell them, I'll say, I need you to understand 80% of what you just said is strictly the libertarian platform. And I'll say, and when you talk about community policing, we call it private policing, but ultimately it's the same thing. It is allowing individual communities to voluntarily determine what policing and first response looks like in their community, and not having some top-down centrally planned thing. When you talk about ending the barriers that are keeping all of us, but especially marginalized communities, from being able to move ahead, That's what we talk about with deregulation. Like we're literally using the same ideas, just different nomenclature. And so it has been incredibly edifying to talk to people that are often in the far, far left, and recognizing that, with the exception of they usually support more, entitlement programs and social safety nets and things like that. When it comes down to how they want the state to interact with us outside of that, we agree basically 100%. And once I demonstrate that we're on the same page there, then we're able to explore that other 20%. And I talk about the idea behind why the government would want to even be giving us crumbs to begin with. Where did that come from? And what is the precept behind that? And that is a structure that's built around the idea of keeping us poor to begin with, and allowing for generational poverty to begin with. And so that I've been able to talk with Black Lives Matters protesters, and by the time the thing's done, they want to end the Fed, because
Yes.
I dial down how the people would never agree to being taxed for a militarized police state and putting people in cages to do free prison labor to the benefit of multi-billion-dollar private, publicly traded, stock market listed for-profit prison labor contractors. We'd never agree to that. So we don't have to. They just print out endless money. And if we take the power, I say, I want to give the ultimate power back to the people, the power to control their own money. And when I put it that way, instead of saying privatization, I say giving the power back to the people, light bulbs go off. Now suddenly they want to end the Fed. They want to talk about sound. I send them links about sound money. And I'm sending them links about, how free market banking would work, and ending the cartel on banking, and how the petrodollar, which is tied to the Federal Reserve, is part and parcel of why countries are being toppled left and right by the military-industrial complex, why the genocide in Yemen is happening right now. It's all tied to destroying anyone who doesn't use the petrodollar that we have the ability that our government has the ability to destroy. And once you can lay it out for them, having met them at their precepts and agreed with them, not just on their concerns, but also on some of their solutions, you can take them on the rest of the journey, because we're the only ones that are being consistent about it.
Wow. Well put. Well put. I know we got to get you out of here quickly. I have two more for you. One is...
Yeah, go ahead.
This one's probably a bit of a softball, given that it's hindsight at this point. But where do you stand on the COVID lockdowns? Do you see that as, I think, probably doing much more harm than good? What are your thoughts on that, on how that should have probably been handled?
It never would have happened if the government hadn't stopped medical professionals from testing and treating and caring for patients that had COVID-19 for the first 6 to 8 weeks that it was here. What a lot of people don't know is that when the first patients were going to doctors and saying, "Doc, I just got back from Wuhan, China, or Hubei province, China, or whatever. I'm not feeling too hot, and I've been watching this thing on the news about this coronavirus. I think I might have it." It was illegal for doctors to test for it. Thankfully, there were because the CDC had regulations in place that say whenever there's a new virus and you want to test for it, you have to go through a Byzantine months-long process of getting approval for it. Months long, meaning they still wouldn't have that approval now, or they would just now be getting that approval. Thankfully, Dr. Helen Chu at the University of Washington in Seattle and some other doctors throughout the country put their Hippocratic Oath above that of that stupid regulation that said that. And they just started making the test, which apparently, if you know how to do such a thing, is fairly easy to make. They made the test. They tested the people. Some of them came back positive. They went to the CDC and said, "Hey, listen, we're already testing people. It's already here. We need to do something." Do you know what the CDC's initial response to that was? And this is not black helicopter stuff. You can read this on the LA Times. Like this is well-known, well-documented fact that's in the news. The CDC's initial response to being told that the pandemic was already here and something needed to be done, they told them, "Do not tell anyone, destroy all those test results, send those patients home and tell them nothing." That is what doctors were being told across this country for the first month and a half to 2 months that it was here. Imagine how many lives could have been saved. Imagine how this entire nonsense with the lockdowns could have been avoided. Imagine how we could be living in a much more safe and contained situation without having to have any real changes to our life by simply allowing the market to fix the problem. allowing medical professionals to test and treat and contain patients who had the virus. If that had happened, if the government had simply removed the boot from the neck of the people, we would not even be dealing with this. Now, let's talk about what we're dealing with. We are dealing with government telling us, do not visit your families, do not go to your churches, do not go to the park, do not go to the beach, and definitely don't go to any small businesses like furniture stores where there might be 6 of you in there at one time or anywhere else, because that's dangerous. Go to Walmart, go to Costco, go to Target, where there will be hundreds of you in the building at the same time. Buy stuff on Amazon, watch Netflix. And if there were any businesses that they couldn't tell you to go to, like airlines and hotels, they just bailed them out with your money. And they gave you $1,200 and told you to stay home forever until they tell you otherwise. And if you go outside, they'll put you in a cage where you're almost assured to get COVID-19 for your safety. The message there is explicit and understandable. If you don't listen to us, we will infect you. They created this. They leveraged it for their own benefit. They robbed us of trillions of our own dollars and gave it to the very people who are benefiting from it. And they gave us $1,200 of our own money and said, if it wasn't for us, you wouldn't have that $1,200. That's my feeling about the lockdowns.
Well put. My goodness. All right. Obviously, we're headed towards a contentious election season. I've got listeners that aren't strict libertarians, maybe a few still. Maybe I'm not doing my job correctly. I've got folks on the right. I know I've got folks on the left. What is your pitch to the people who aren't quite yet sold on voting for you and Dr. Jorgensen?
Absolutely. So I encourage you to look at the history of American governance. The Republicans and Democrats have had exclusive control of every aspect, every lever of power in American government, from top to bottom, from city, region, state, all the way up to the federal government and everything in between. Every situation we are facing, they did to us. And not just the side you like less than the other side. Name a situation, and both parties are heavily knee-deep, really waist-deep in it. They have all done it. Let's look at police brutality. If you're on the left, you recognize Donald Trump is uniquely terrible when it comes to police brutality. He actively talks about how the National Guard should be called in to dominate the streets. He has, gone and talked to police unions and given speeches and encouraged them multiple times, even before he was running for office. He has routinely encouraged police officers to rough up the people that they are arresting, because he knows that he'll never have to interact with them, because he's wealthy and he has private security. And he's not concerned about the fact that policing disproportionately affects marginalized communities, communities of color, the poor, the homeless, migrants, and so forth, gender and sexual minority. He doesn't care about that because he's none of those things. He's a very, very wealthy and powerful man. And so they can abuse those people however they wish. But let's look at Joe Biden. Joe Biden has signed off on every single part of the militarized, racist police state, from the war on drugs to the minimum sentencing to the 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine, for no other reason than crack is more used by black people and powder cocaine is more used by white people. It's the same drug. He has signed off. He helped, was the architect for the civil asset forfeiture program, where government steals from people who haven't even been found guilty of anything yet. And if they are able to actually, be found not guilty or have the charges dropped, they have to sue and pay to get their own stuff back, even though they didn't even do anything wrong. He's the architect of that. He's the architect of the militarized police state. He is the architect of things like no-knock raids. He's the architect of every aspect of everything you hate. He is a man who in 1977, 10 years after segregation had ended, said that he was against integration because he didn't want his children to live in a racial jungle. This is who the Democrats and Republicans present to you as the options moving forward. And we could do the same thing for those on the right. Donald Trump said he was going to drain the swamp. He's now the king of the swamp creatures. He said that he was going to end wasteful spending. He spent more than any other president in one term. He has spent more than any other president. He said he was going to end the deficit. He has spent more debt than any other president in one term. He said he was going to end the wars. There are 15,000 more troops overseas than there were when he came into office. He said he was going to cut taxes. The average American is paying a higher tax burden, including tariffs, than they were when he came into office. He said he was going to win the trade wars. Trade wars are at all-time highs. Trade disparity is at all-time highs. People are losing their jobs left and right because of his terrible policies. And of course, we know the Democrats wouldn't be any better on this. The Libertarian Party is the only party who is presenting a way forward, a way out of what Republicans and Democrats have given you. The Libertarian Party believes that you should be set free, that the people who have held you down should be removed from those positions of power, that their systems that they have put up should be dismantled so no one else can ever do it to you again, and that we should, as a people, moving forward together, be able to help each other. Imagine a world in which the wars have ended, the troops are home, the healing can begin. Imagine a world in which the war on drugs has ended. People get to go home. They've been set free from prison. They don't have their felony record anymore. Imagine a world in which greedy corporations can't benefit to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars to drive up the cost of your healthcare, and government and its cronies are removed so your healthcare can be affordable. Imagine a world in which the education decisions for you and your children can be made by you and your children, and those same politicians and craven cronies are taken out so that the decisions are made between you and the teacher for your children. Imagine a world in which you don't have to worry about your ability to keep and bear arms so that you can defend yourself and the people you care about. Imagine a world that is safer and in which you are happier and healthier and freer. That is a world that Joe Jorgensen and I fight for every single day. And with your support and your vote in November, that is exactly what we will do.
My goodness, I want to jump up and yell in excitement. That was so good. Where can they, real quick, plug away on the website?
Absolutely. So our website is joj2020.com. That's joj2020.com. If you want to find my social media, I am at Real Spike Cohen on Twitter, and on Facebook, I am at facebook.com/literally Spike Cohen. Or if you just search for Spike Cohen in the old Facebook address bar there, you will find my page. And of course, you can find Jo Jorgensen on all social media. She is on everything. If you look for Jo Jorgensen, you will absolutely find her. And again, it's joj2020.com. If you'd like to join us, there's a volunteer form there. If you are able to give, we would greatly appreciate your donations. There is a donation button there, and we would greatly appreciate it. And thank you for your time, Buck. I greatly appreciate being on this show.
Spike, that was incredible. Thank you so much for being here on Death to Tyrants, and we will talk soon. Thank you, man.
Death to Tyrants. Thank you guys so much. Have a great night.
And that was Spike Cohen. I know you guys had to dig that. What a cool, well-spoken messenger of liberty. Excellent job, Spike. Glad to have you on here. So you heard a lot about the Libertarian Party there. If you'd like to join after hearing all of that, I've got a link for you guys, and that's at lp.org/death to tyrants. And let's see, what else we got? Facebook.com/death to tyrants podcast. Follow me on Twitter at Buck Rebel, BuckRebel. And here's the fun one. We've got a Patreon page for this podcast. I'm going to let you guess. What would that be at? You got it. Patreon.com/death to tyrants. Now, up until recently, it's just been, you guys have supported me, and I've truly appreciated it. I've always told you every dime I make there goes directly to this podcast. You've got my word. Well, starting pretty soon here, there's going to be some special edition podcast episodes exclusively for Patreon members. And I will be joined oftentimes by a special guest. And we'll probably talk about current topics of the moment. There's so many. God dang, they go by every minute at this point, and there's something new to jump onto. But we'll try to keep up. And I give you our thoughts on the topic of the day, we'll say, through a libertarian, ANCAP, hardcore libertarian free market lens. And so I think you'll enjoy that if you become a Patreon donator over at patreon.com/death to tyrants. I think that about does all my housekeeping work for this week. Thank you guys for joining up. There's been a lot of new people. Really appreciate the downloads and the feedback and the reviews over at iTunes. Until next week, you guys have a good one.
You get split in fucking half, but I call him the hologram brass. But I am the center inside the placenta of math. You clash with cyanide gas and die fast. Rhythmical equivalent of solids, liquids, and gas. We smash your sinus with the power of Lord Titus. But I am the virus inside of the iris of Cyrus.
Like the sound of the Death to Tyrants podcast? Our audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.